The first and easiest question here is, does it impact the authorization boundary? Second question, does it fall under one of the categories that we just talked about in that table? If it doesn't, it's likely not significant. The next step is conducting that security impact analysis. And at this point, you might be wondering, why do I even have to care about this? Why can't I just follow my standard change management processes? If you don't follow the SCR process, it could result in anything from a detailed finding review, a corrective action plan, or worst case scenario, revocation of your ATO.
Hey everybody, welcome to another great episode of Hive Live.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another great episode of Hive Live. I'm Katie Dodson here with my colleague Andrew Bradley to tell you everything you ever wanted to know about FedRAMP significant change requests. Hopefully, you've been following all of our great approachable cybersecurity content on social media, but if you haven't, you can find us on all the major channels at Hive Systems. Make sure to give us a follow and subscribe. For this month's Hive Live, we'll be walking through what is and is not an SCR, the SCR process with FedRAMP, and some special change types. As a disclaimer, FedRAMP is currently piloting a new SCR process to help streamline SCRs. What we cover today will go over the SCR process as it stands today, but we will be sure to put out an update when we have more information. So let's get into it. First and foremost, what is a significant change? FedRAMP defines a significant change as any change that is likely to substantively affect the security or privacy posture of the information system. Not the most helpful definition, as it is pretty broad. Especially for those larger cloud service offerings that make a lot of different types of changes within their authorization boundary throughout the year, it can be a real challenge to understand exactly what falls into this category. Which is why FedRAMP also put out this lovely table full of all the different types of changes that could be considered significant. So I see some of these on here are a little clearer. So obviously FIPS 199 categorization change, introducing new boundary protection mechanisms, things that don't necessarily happen all that frequently, but would have a significant security impact on your boundary are going to fall under this process. But there's quite a few in here that maybe can lead to a little bit more confusion. And I'll turn it over to Andrew to talk about some of those.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know this table is not exactly, a very direct guide on exactly what types of changes might be considered significant, but FedRAMP did, I think the best job they possibly could in trying to encompass at least the topic areas for you to spur discussion while you're going through change management. So when you're talking about things like new technology, right, like new operating system variant, they're not talking about maybe a one-off server here or there. If you're going to introduce it to test or you're kind of just piloting something, they're talking about major migrations. Let's say you're moving from, you're moving from Red Hat Linux 7 to Amazon Linux 2 or Amazon Linux 3. That's something that for like your large infrastructure support servers, that is something that might constitute like a new technology from an operating system variant perspective. Again, introducing new commercial off-the-shelf products and tools and applications that are specifically designed to impact, the security posture, or that may have an impact on the security posture. Things like configuration management tools, actual security tools like vulnerability scanners, or other third-party services, even cloud service providers like a new SEM, for example. You want to roll one of those out. That's something that might trigger the new technology type here, and you would potentially have to put that through your SCR process. There's a bunch of other ones on here, like upgrade of the operating system. Again, we're not talking about like an upgrade of one server here or deploying Microsoft patches or anything like that. We're talking about major lifts and version updates for migrations and new like large scale rollouts across the organization. New virtual servers, this is another one that causes some issues here. People see new virtual server, they think like every time they have to they're standing up a new server, whether it's through auto scaling or other modern efficiency and optimization techniques, that they think that this means they have to put it through an SCR process. New virtual servers, again, they're talking about large scale systems or large scope of change type things that have some significant impact on the boundary or change the security posture overall. So standing up a new Windows 11 member server or file server or something like that probably won't meet the bar of an SCR, but standing up 20 of them to support a new microservice that you're implementing would fit the bill for an SCR. So as you're working your way through these things, you kind of have to critically think internally about what these categories actually mean and what the actual risk that the FedRAMP PMO is looking to address is, and part of that is going to happen in your significant change security impact analysis. But the other part of that is defining these things up front so that your engineers, your product management folks, your product delivery folks know what they have to put through the SCR process. So the best practice here is to take this list as a basic template and expand on it internally with things that you think might have some sort of security impact or address a risk that the FedRAMP PMO is looking to address by mentioning these types of categories. A new interconnection, for example, or changes to current interconnections. They're really looking to see if you guys are adding new services that are connecting or communicating with the boundary. There's new access pathways, there's new data flows or transfers, bidirectional, unidirectional. They're trying to see if there's any risk to the data in the environment. So when you're thinking about like whether an API, connecting an API inside the boundary to a system outside the boundary, and you're maybe dumping off some marketing information, non-federal data, non-metadata, that's the type of thing you have to consider when you're putting all of these things through your significant change process. So while this is a good starting point, it's definitely not the end point, and the organization should definitely look to expand on these definitions and define them internally and come up with a process that they can use to explain to their 3POW and demonstrate to their 3POW and their agency AOs, who are ultimately responsible for accepting the risks, that they have a handle on what is significant versus what is not significant. If the AO disagrees, they'll let you know. Yep, and we just kind of talked about like what might be significant changes based on the table there, and this is an example of some of the stuff that is probably not a significant change. Like we said, routine patch management activities, stuff you're doing to remediate vulnerabilities in ad hoc patch management. That type of stuff isn't going to need to go through an SCR process. Put it through regular change management. It is business as usual type activities. Capacity management, elastic service type stuff, automation, infrastructure automation. Unless you're doing large scale deployments, large scale provisioning, again, not probably a significant change. Failover testing, we haven't touched on this one yet, but let's say you guys are doing some backup testing, which is required by FedRAMP, or some failover testing for your contingency planning activities. That type of testing is not considered a significant change. You don't have to run that up the chain to get any sort of approval. It's something that you can do. In fact, you're required to do it. So don't wait on a significant change to be able to do your contingency plan testing and your failover testing. Some of the other things on the list here are pretty self-explanatory. Fixing misconfiguration, same thing as routine patch management. Bug or defect fixes that don't require a huge security effort, like replacing an entire code library or code base element that might have some significant impact to the environment. That type of stuff is all business as usual. And then when we talk about releases, this one always comes up as well. Organizations kind of struggle and ask, do I have to put every single release through the significant change request process? And generally, no. Minor releases tend to be stuff more like bug fixes, hot fixes, stuff that doesn't have any tangible impact to the authorization boundary. It's not changing your control posture. It's not changing your control environment. But larger releases, major version releases, where like new features might be implemented, or a new way of implementing a control, or a new way of implementing a feature that you had previously, or a new service or microservice, those types of major changes, or new SKUs even that for subscribers, that's the type of stuff that might trigger a significant change. But in general, minor releases for bug fixes and things of that nature, and optimization, code-based optimization, that type of stuff you can leave off the list. That's not to say it doesn't have to go through your standard change management process, which everything does, and your standard SDLC. But as far as SCR is concerned, you can pretty much leave that one off the SCR and ConMon discussion table.
All right, so now that we know what types of changes might be significant, how do you kind of take that next step to determine it definitely is? The first and easiest question here is, does it impact the authorization boundary? If the change that you're implementing has nothing to do with your authorization boundary, it has nothing to do with FedRAMP and does not touch the significant change request process. Second question, does it fall under one of the categories that we just talked about in that table? If it doesn't, it's likely not significant. It probably falls under one of the types of examples that we just discussed on the not significant change slide. But if it does, then the next step is conducting that security impact analysis that Andrew was talking about. Every change that falls under one of those categories needs to have a security impact analysis to determine whether or not that change is going to be significant. And ultimately, that's an initial step into the significant change request process anyway. So if you do find out that your change is significant and you have to do all the paperwork, you're going to need the SIA anyway.
Yeah, that's a good point. So CIAs are required for all changes regardless. But when you do consider something that might be significant, there are additional requirements for your CIA that will help you along the way and streamline some of the SCR processes down the road for sure.
And at this point, you might be wondering, why do I even have to care about this? Why can't I just follow my standard change management processes? And the answer is right here. If you don't follow the SCR process and the 3POW finds out later or PMO finds out later, it could result in anything from a detailed finding review, a corrective action plan, or worst case scenario, revocation of your ATO. The ATO that you get for your environment is based on a point in time assessment. If you make a change to what was assessed and there is a security impact and you don't follow this process and don't do the proper testing, there could be some serious consequences.
Yep. And we don't want to fearmonger here because the significant change request process is difficult for all organizations. Everybody struggles with determining what is significant and what is not. That's why keeping your AO in the loop, your agency authorizing official in the loop early on as part of those collaborative ConMon calls, notifying them of changes up front so they can help you make the determination, because ultimately it's up to them whether they truly believe it's significant or not, and it has to go through this process. You give them as much information as you can, and they'll help you come back and understand whether it is truly significant and it has to go through this process. And at the same time, if there is a miss, if something does happen where you guys do miss it, something that should have gone through the SCR process, be proactive about it. Don't be overly reactive, but make sure that you are owning up to it, notifying the FedRAMP PMO, notifying the agency authorizing officials, and even engaging with your 3POW as soon as possible to basically, say a little bit of a mea culpa there and get this stuff put through the SCR process if it's the recommendation of the AO as soon as possible, even though it may already be in your operating in your authorization boundary. So taking those proactive steps will help you fend off some of these escalation levels, which you can actually find these in the ConMon performance guide, which is up on the FedRAMP templates and documents site.
So how do you actually initiate an SCR? Now you've gone through the process of doing your SIA, you've determined that it is significant. First and foremost, you continue to follow your change management processes for that environment. Andrew mentioned this earlier. You have to still do your standard change management, follow your SDLC processes, make sure that everything is secure around implementing that change. There's just some additional steps that have to happen before you can actually deploy to testing and then to your production environment. So once you've determined it's significant, you start filling out the significant change request form template. There's a lot of different information that needs to go into this. Some of those things are, your system diagrams, pre and post change, your security controls that are impacted as a result of the change, a description for what you're changing and why, what the justification is. And then you also need to start engaging with your 3POW early on in the process so that they can help fill out some of the documentation as well. One of the things that's required for the SCR template is the security assessment plan that will be built by the 3POW. So coordinating with them as early as possible in this process is critical to make sure that you are getting all the paperwork completed accurately, getting a plan in place for your assessment, getting that scheduled so that it lines up with your overall timelines for this process. And it's really important to note that you have to engage with the 3POW and submit the documentation 30 days before you plan to implement, because they have to complete the assessment before you are even allowed to implement. If you don't give enough time, then the SCR, you essentially end up having to delay the change in the first place because you need to give all the time.
Yep, and you absolutely want to be proactive about discussing the upcoming changes with your 3POW. So giving yourself even more lead time is even better here, because that's where you might discover that this isn't something that the AO considers, the agency authorizing official considers significant. So you don't have to even go down this road. But doing that up front, only gets things moving faster for your organization. So here you're not stuck waiting on, decision from your agency AOs. You're not waiting on the 3POW assessment to be completed before you guys absolutely have to move forward. One thing to note here, the security controls that are impacted, that's something that you're going to identify in your security impact analysis. So you'll look at all your controls from your FedRAMP baseline and SSP Appendix A, and you will look to determine whether or not there is some tangible impact to the either the description of that control, the way it's implemented, the implementation status, where it's being implemented, whether that's now it's being inherited from a third party or it's something that's being brought in-house and being implemented directly by your organization. The SIA is meant to facilitate identifying those impacted controls. That is not the only thing that goes into selecting the impacted controls. There is a baseline of controls that the FedRAMP PMO believes are generally impacted by certain types of changes. So inside of the significant change request policy and procedures document, which is also up on the template site, there is a list of baseline controls that must be included in the 3POW security assessment plan. You can work with the 3POW because they may actually say, we don't think these controls are necessarily impacted, so we can take them out of the scope and they'll provide a justification. Or they may add additional controls on top of what you believe is impacted, what the FedRAMP PMO believes is typically impacted, and what they think is impacted. So you want to work hand in hand with your 3POW to develop that control set and make sure that's fully documented in the security assessment plan, because that needs to get communicated to the AO to inform their decision 30 days prior to the implementation.
So you can see here that there's quite a lot of different stakeholders and phases and documents and processes and parts of the overall SCR process here. And there are a lot of gates along the way. So going back to having to submit 30 days in advance, that's essentially going to set the timeline for the rest of your testing and your deployment to production and everything else. So again, your change owners follow the standard change control processes. They submit a change, work on the significant impact analysis, and probably in conjunction with your compliance or GRC team are going to look and determine whether that needs to follow the SCR process with FedRAMP. If it does, the teams will fill out the SCR form template, the SIA, get all of that submitted to the 3POW, get the SAP, all the rest of the documentation, and then work with the 3POW to get that submitted to the agency AO. As Andrew mentioned earlier, the AO is the one who ultimately makes that risk decision about whether or not something is significant and whether or not they're going to approve the whole package. So engaging with them early in the process is really important. If they don't think your paperwork is sufficient, if there's questions, if they need additional information, you kind of just go loop back to that initial documentation step and work with your 3POW again. But if they find that everything is buttoned up and makes sense, they'll go ahead and approve that that can go to testing so that the 3POW can perform their assessment. So your teams will deploy to testing just like they would with their regular SDLC process, but not until they have confirmed that that has been approved by the agency AO. And then you'll get your testing done and the 3POW will develop their security assessment report, the results of your assessment. They'll pull together a briefing. They'll share that with your company. They'll also share that with the agency AO to see if the agency AO approves based on the testing results. If they don't, again, go back to the drawing board, go back to documentation step and start over. But if they approve it at that point, once you have confirmed approval from the agency AO, it can be deployed to production. Your documentation, like your SSP and everything else, can be updated to reflect that change. And you can move on with your standard ConMon processes.
Yep. And just one thing to note, this is a generalized process here overview, and there's a similar process guide in the SCR policies and procedures. The agency AOs can technically dictate what this process looks like based on the feedback that they have for you about the change or what they're willing to accept as far as evaluation and assessment of the risk that's associated with any particular change. So it may be subject to change on an agency by agency basis, but this is the general workflow. And as you can see, it does take some time to work your way through.
So that was the generalized SCR process, but there are a couple of special use cases that we're going to talk about next. Some things that have additional steps in that standard SCR process, and then some that have completely different processes altogether. So Andrew, I don't know if you want to talk about the first couple here, and I can talk about the new cloud service offerings when we get to the end. Yeah,
sure. So new technology, basically if you guys are deploying like a new third-party service or a piece of COTS software or tooling, the 3POW is going to have to verify this, specifically the inherited control set, and verify that you've essentially accounted for all of your responsibilities within any CIS or CRM that the cloud service provider that you're leveraging has maintained. So in the case of a third-party cloud service offering that you intend to leverage for your authorization boundary, you are not necessarily able to inherit all of the controls there, or even a small subset of the controls. It depends on the type of service and what that CSP has documented in that CIS and CRM, so that your organization is really responsible for understanding what your responsibilities are in the implementation of all the controls relevant to that new service or technology. And basically, what they're going to do is they're going to evaluate your CAS CRM. They're going to evaluate your SSP appendix to see if you have updated documentation to support how you intend to implement those controls, or they'll do interview and walkthrough discussion if you haven't had a chance to update the documentation yet. And they're just going to verify that you have that all your bases covered when it comes to controls that are inheritable versus not inheritable. For moderate to high FIPS 199 change, there is a specific FedRAMP High readiness assessment report that is required before you can actually complete the SCR for a moderate to high change, basically the impact level change for your cloud service offering. So that has to be completed first. If there's any issues with that, they have to be resolved before you then go through the additional security assessment report, the final security assessment report, that will test then the high level baseline of controls and verify that you don't have any high risk POAM items, and convey that information just like you do for your annual assessment report to the agency AOs for risk-based decision. Once that is completed and submitted to the Connect repository and communicated to the FedRAMP PMO, once essentially all the I's are dotted and all the T's are crossed there, the FedRAMP PMO will then make the determination to change the marketplace designation for your service offering from a moderate to a high impact level service. And then new code release. Not all code releases are significant changes. We talked about this before, some minor version updates, hot fixes, bug fixes, stuff like that happen in the interim, kind of efficiency gaining things or fixing UX type issues. That's not necessarily a significant change. So there's more focus placed on the stuff that has direct security impact, like new features embedded in new code releases, new service offerings, new microservices associated with those service offerings, or just new control implementations or updates to control implementations on the application side that you're providing a new release for. So you have to complete a CF for all the code releases to determine whether that SCR form is needed. And in a lot of cases, you may actually decide or may actually determine from that SIA that there is no impact to the security control environment, so you do not have to do an SCR process. But it is still something that you will need to do a security impact analysis for each of those releases, just to be sure. And then for the new cloud service offering or feature, I'll turn that back over to you, Katie.
Yeah, so we're going to spend a little extra time on this one because it is very unique. It's probably one of the more complex cases when it comes to significant changes. But basically what happened here is FedRAMP recognized that their process takes a while, and it was really hindering some of the cloud service providers that released maybe 2 or 3 different new offerings or services a month in their platforms. So they kind of came up with a expedited process for these significant changes. But there were a lot of different hoops to jump through to even be eligible to use this process. So they made a very narrow window of what actually falls under this type of change. So the changes themselves have to have absolutely no impact on the already authorized architecture and controls. They also need to not have any service-specific or feature-specific controls that need to be added when you are adding the service or feature. And they also have to have no impact on continuous monitoring activities. The SDLC process and your configuration management have to be mature enough to ensure that there will be no impact to your ConMon as these features are onboarded. So before you can even consider using this option, you basically have to have almost no impact on what already exists in your environment. So if you happen to fall into that category, what happens next is you have to go through an evaluation period. You pick a specific type or category of service or feature that you're going to have a lot of over time, and you take a sample size of 2 and run it through this evaluation process. So it's going to be very rigorous, just like the standard SCR process. You have a whole lot of testing, a lot of paperwork, and there's going to be an evaluation of the impact to the controls for the first set of this type of offering or service. And the AO basically will make a risk-based decision on whether or not, once you've gone through that process, if it went smoothly, if they felt like you had all your ducks in a row, they feel like for that specific type of change, you are now going to be okay to follow the expedited process moving forward. So once you get through that lengthy hurdle of becoming eligible for that specific category, like not every category, it's only for the 2 types that were tested, then you are at that point able to basically skip to attestation. So rather than having to submit everything to your agency AO and then go through the 3POW assessment and get your SAR and everything else, the 3POW is instead going to be able to kind of check a couple things, like do some interviews, look at your vulnerability scan results, look at last year's annual assessment testing, and look at your pen testing results. And that's all they're going to need to basically sign off and say that those particular services and features are approved to be implemented in the production environment. And then they will go and actually test those controls thoroughly during the next annual assessment. So a huge benefit if you can actually make it through the initial hurdles, makes your release process a lot faster. That being said, if you start going through this process and go through the whole lengthy evaluation and come to the end and your AO says, no, I don't think you're eligible, you still have to go through the standard SCR process again. So it's really a business decision on what is more worth it for your organization. There's a lot of legwork up front to be eligible for this process. And if you're going to have lots of different types of service offerings and features, you're going to have to do this for each type that you plan to carry forward as part of this process. Yep. So it does exist. It may help some companies, but in the end, even if you do have this option, it may be more worth your time to still follow the standard SCR process. That's entirely up to you. All right, turn it over to you, Andrew, to close us out.
Sure. So we had some pretty big key takeaways here, and I just kind of wanted to touch back on the new cloud service offering a little bit there. So honestly, I have not seen a lot of organizations take advantage of that, just because most of them don't have that many new service offerings or new features of the same type that frequently annually to be able to leverage that process. And many of them have targeted kind of having a more streamlined or mature general significant change request process to where they're comfortable with the lead time and the requirements for putting those changes through the general process that they're familiar with. It's kind of like the devil you know scenario, versus having to go through the heavy initial evaluation for changes that may or may not occur at volume or may not be kind enough to fit the mold. So that's just something that I haven't, in general, I haven't seen a lot of organizations adopt that process yet. It's not to say there aren't some out there, but the ones that I've worked with haven't really worked on that yet. So some key takeaways here. Changes that. What we're really focusing on here are changes that may impact the security control environment, the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of any of that federal data or metadata that you guys are storing or processing, or the change in the scope of the cloud service offerings authorization boundary. So you're expanding the boundary, adding new services, adding new major components, any big changes to that inventory workbook you guys are maintaining, where you're adding hundreds of assets there, maybe tens of hundreds of assets. Stuff like that is what we're talking about here. We're not focusing on the minute change or the small configuration change. We're looking at the grandiose things that have major security impact to the environment. So SCRs do include a myriad of requirements that you just don't have in their standard change management process. That 3POW assessment of the impact of controls is something that provides a lot of assurance for the AOs, but puts you guys behind the 8 ball when it comes to getting things out quickly and maybe beating competitors to market. So that's definitely something to consider as you guys are either building up your environment. Maybe you want to do a split commercial environment and a split FedRAMP environment. That's why here you can push stuff out to commercial as quickly as you want to meet the market need, and reserve stuff for the government clients or the federal clients in a little bit of a slower rollout, considering the SCR process. But this way here, your business on the commercial side is less impacted by this this rigmarole you have to go through. And CSPs might have a well-defined and repeatable process for ensuring that those changes aren't implemented without going through the SCR process. If you're not in that boat right now, there is the potential for ConMon escalation, performance management escalation issues. So we've seen this at places we've been, Katie. There's some organizations that are better than others at identifying significant changes, getting through some of the red tape of their own internal bureaucracy when it comes to decisions on when to roll things out, put things in production, flip the switch. Sometimes the business doesn't understand the requirements of the FedRAMP program, and they're misaligned. There's a misaligned incentive, and that could lead to performance plans, basically, like the designation for review, or the detailed finding review, or the suspension or revocation of your status. So you want to stay on top of this process. Make sure it is as well documented, repeatable, and you know what? If you're going to rely on engineers and you're going to rely on the IT folks to make decisions about whether a change is significant or not, give them as much information as possible. To take that change type table and list as many examples of changes you think might fit the bill for those types of things. Define them. Work with your cross business stakeholders to refine that list, and get to a place where everybody agrees that, okay, all of these types of changes are definitely going to go through this process, and you'll cut down on your potential misses there by a lot. Just having that repeatable process is paramount to success when it comes to SCRs. And then, as we talked about, the agencies are the final arbiter. So I know some agencies that are fairly lenient in this process, whereas if you notify them of a change, they will very quickly tell you whether or not they believe it's significant or not, even if you put it through your own your SIA and it tells you it's significant. They may think otherwise, and that's, hey, take a free pass, take a win where you can get it. If the AO for an agency doesn't think it's something that's significant, don't put it through the process. Feel free to put it through your regular change management process, which you still have to do, regular SDLC, and deploy it. Now, there's something we haven't touched on a little bit here, which I think we'll touch on maybe a little bit either after this slide, or we could touch on it now. FedRAMP released a continuous monitoring, a collaborative continuous monitoring guide back in, I think it was the summer of last year, when the Rev 5 updates started emerging and some of the transition information came out. This collaborative ConMon process basically takes and builds upon ConMon to the point where agencies previously weren't as in the loop on continuous monitoring as they should have been. A lot of CSPs would go to the FedRAMP PMO, and they would go to the agency sponsor that they had initially when they got their authorization, and they'll notify them of SCRs. But other agencies that have issued ATOs for that cloud service offering were never really consulted. They had no idea of some of the risks associated with some of these changes. In some cases, there might have been some for companies that are working on private cloud or single tenant implementations that are varied across the spectrum there. Might have even broken things for some of those customers. So the collaborative ConMon guides, the purpose of that document has been to really guide CSPs in creating this process whereby there is a monthly or semi-monthly meeting between the CSP, the agency sponsor AO, and then any other agency AO that has whose agency has provided an ATO for your organization and is using your product. It's basically a forum that you put together, invite them to that call, and you discuss things through an agenda like the POAMs from ConMon, the any risks that have been identified, your annual assessment reports, the deviation requests for vulnerability management for things outside the SLAs, and SCRs. And SCRs is a big one here because this gives you the ability to be proactive across all of the agencies, not just with your agency sponsor. Let them know something is coming or planned, and then when it does come time to submit the documentation and get that approval to move forward, which you're supposed to get 30 days in advance, as we'll keep harping on that point, you can get that from other agencies, not just your sponsor agency. And the sponsor agency technically can't accept the risk for those other agencies anyway. So just getting your sponsor AO's approval isn't necessarily good enough. You have to run it by all of those other agencies that have authorized you for use as well. So that's just something to keep in mind, and I wanted to make sure that everybody's aware of that. And if you're looking for more information about that collaborative ConMon process, that guide is actually really well documented, and it's up on the FedRAMP documents and templates as well as the continuous monitoring performance management guide, which will let you know exactly how you fail those ConMon requirements, and if something should happen there, and what the escalation process is, and what your responsibility is for all that. So I highly recommend reviewing both of those documents as soon as possible.
All right. That's all the time we have today. So we want to thank you for joining us for our overview of FedRAMP's SCR process. As always, our experts here at Hive Systems can make your cybersecurity journey more approachable. So please reach out anytime by visiting us at www.hivesystems.com. Before we go, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you can be alerted for our next episode by going to www.hivesystems.com/HiveLive. Next month, we're going to be talking about another exciting topic from the world of cybersecurity, so make sure you don't miss it by subscribing to our channel. Until next time, remember, when it comes to cybersecurity, you need to act and not react.